Section 14 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 4, Chapter 5. Towards the end of the session of 1836, the hopes of the Conservative party were again in the ascendant. The tadpoles and the tapers had infused such enthusiasm into all the country attorneys, who, in their turn, had so bedevilled the registration, that it was whispered in the utmost confidence, but as a flagrant truth, that reaction was at length a great fact. All that was required was the opportunity. But as the existing Parliament was not 2 years old, and the government had an excellent working majority, it seemed that the occasion could scarcely be furnished. Under these circumstances, the backstairs politicians, not content with having by their premature movements already seriously damaged the career of their leader, to whom in public they pretended to be devoted, began weaving again their old intrigues about the court, and not without effect. It was said that the royal ear lent itself with no marked repugnance to suggestions which might rid the sovereign of ministers, who, after all, were the ministers not of his choice, but of his necessity. But William IV, after 2 failures in a similar attempt, after his respective embarrassing interviews with Lord Grey and Lord Melbourne on their return to office in 1832 and 1835, was resolved never to make another move unless it were a checkmate. The King, therefore, listened and smiled, and loved to talk to his favourites of his private feelings and secret hopes, the first outraged, the second cherished, and a little of these revelations of royalty was distilled to great personages, who in their turn spoke hypothetically to their hangers-on of royal dispositions and possible contingencies, while the hangers-on and go-betweens in their turn looked more than they expressed, took county members by the button into a corner, and advised as friends the representatives of boroughs to look sharply after the next registration. Lord Monmouth, who was never greater than in adversity, and whose favourite excitement was to aim at the impossible, had never been more resolved on a dukedom than when the Reform Act deprived him of the 12 votes which he had accumulated to obtain that object. While all his companions in discomfiture were bewailing their irretrievable overthrow, Lord Monmouth became almost a convert to the measure, which had furnished his devising and daring mind, palled with prosperity, and satiated with a life of success, with an object and the stimulating enjoyment of a difficulty. He had early resolved to appropriate to himself a division of the county in which his chief seat was situate; but what most interested him, because it was most difficult, was the acquisition of one of the new boroughs that was in his vicinity, and in which he possessed considerable property. The borough, however, was a manufacturing town, and returning only 1 member, it had hitherto sent up to Westminster a radical shopkeeper, one Mr. Jawster Sharp, who had taken what is called a leading part in the town on every crisis that had occurred since 1830, one of those zealous patriots who had got up penny subscriptions for gold cups to Lord Grey, cries for the bill, the whole bill, and nothing but the bill, and public dinners where the victual was devoured before grace was said, a worthy who makes speeches, passes resolutions, votes addresses, goes up with the deputations, has at all time the necessary quantity of confidence in the necessary individual, confidence in Lord Grey, confidence in Lord Durham, confidence in Lord Melbourne, and can also, if necessary, give 3 cheers for the King, or 3 groans for the Queen. But the days of the genus Jawster Sharp were over in this borough as well as in many others. He had contrived in his lustre of agitation to feather his nest pretty successfully, by which he had lost public confidence and gained his private end. 3 hungry Jawster Sharps, his hopeful sons, had all become commissioners of one thing or another, temporary appointments with interminable duties. A Low Church son-in-law found himself comfortably seated in a chancellor's living, and several cousins and nephews were busy in the excise. But Jawster Sharp himself was as pure as Cato. He had always said that he would never touch the public money, and he had kept his word. It was an understood thing that Jawster Sharp was never to show his face again on the hustings of Darlford. The Liberal party was determined to be represented in future by a man of station, substance, character, a true reformer, but one who wanted nothing for himself, and therefore might, if needful, get something for them. They were looking out for such a man, but were in no hurry. The seat was looked upon as a good thing, a contest certainly, every place is contested now, but as certainly a large majority. Notwithstanding all this confidence, however, reaction or registration, or some other mystification, had produced effects even in this creature of the Reform Bill, the good borough of Darlford. The borough that, out of gratitude to Lord Grey, returned a jobbing shopkeeper twice to Parliament as its representative without a contest, had now a Conservative association, with a banker for its chairman, and a brewer for its vice president, and 4 sharp lawyers nibbing their pens, noting their memorandum books, and assuring their neighbours with a consoling and complacent air that property must tell in the long run. Whispers were also about that when the proper time arrived, a Conservative candidate would certainly have the honour of addressing the electors. No name mentioned, but it was not concealed that he was to be of no ordinary calibre, a tried man, a distinguished individual, who had already fought the battle of the Constitution and served his country in eminent posts, honoured by the nation, favoured by his sovereign. These important and encouraging intimations were ably diffused in the columns of the Conservative journal, and in a style which, from its high tone, evidently indicated no ordinary source and no common pen. Indeed, there appeared occasionally in this paper articles written with such unusual vigour that the proprietors of the Liberal journal almost felt the necessity of getting some eminent hand down from town to compete with them. It was impossible that they could emanate from the rival editor. They knew well the length of their brother's tether. Had they been more versant in the periodical literature of the day, they might, in this slashing style, have caught perhaps a glimpse of the future candidate for their borough, the Right Honourable Nicholas Rigby. Lord Monmouth, though he had been absent from England since 1832, had obtained from his vigilant correspondent a current knowledge of all that had occurred in the interval, all the hopes, fears, plans, prospects, manoeuvres, and machinations, their rise and fall, how some had bloomed, others were blighted, not a shade of reaction that was not represented to him, not the possibility of an adhesion that was not duly reported. He could calculate at Naples at any time within 10 the result of a dissolution. The season of the year had prevented him crossing the Alps in 1834, and after the general election he was too shrewd a practiser in the political world to be deceived as to the ultimate result. Lord Eskdale, in whose judgment he had more confidence than in that of any individual, had told him from the first that the pear was not ripe. Rigby, who always hedged against his interest by the fulfilment of his prophecy of irremediable discomfiture, was never very sanguine. Indeed, the whole affair was always considered premature by the good judges, and a long time elapsed before Tadpole and Taper recovered their secret influence, or resumed their ostentatious loquacity, or their silent insolence. The pear, however, was now ripe. Even Lord Eskdale wrote that after the forthcoming registration a bet was safe, and Lord Monmouth had the satisfaction of drawing the Whig minister at Naples into a cool 1,000 on the event. Soon after this he returned to England, and determined to pay a visit to Coningsby Castle, feast the country, patronise the borough, diffuse that confidence in the party which his presence never failed to do. So great and so just was the reliance in his unerring powers of calculation and his intrepid pluck. Notwithstanding Schedule A, the prestige of his power had not sensibly diminished, for his essential resources were vast, and his intellect always made the most of his influence. True, however, to his organisation, Lord Monmouth, even to save his party and gain his dukedom, must not be bored. He therefore filled his castle with the most agreeable people from London, and even secured for their diversion a little troupe of French comedians. Thus supported, he received his neighbours with all the splendour befitting his immense wealth and great position, and with one charm which even immense wealth and great position cannot command, the most perfect manner in the world. Indeed, Lord Monmouth was one of the most finished gentlemen that ever lived, and as he was good-natured, and for a selfish man even good-humoured, there was rarely a cloud of caprice or ill temper to prevent his fine manners having their fair play. The country neighbours were all fascinated. They were received with so much dignity and dismissed with so much grace. Nobody would believe a word of the stories against him. Had he lived all his life at Coningsby, fulfilled every duty of a great English nobleman, benefited the country, loaded the inhabitants with favours, he would not have been half so popular as he found himself within a fortnight of his arrival, with the worst county reputation conceivable, and every little squire vowing that he would not even leave his name at the Castle to show his respect. Lord Monmouth, whose contempt for mankind was absolute, not a fluctuating sentiment, not a mournful conviction ebbing and flowing with the circumstances, but a fixed, profound, unalterable instinct, who never loved any one, and never hated any one except his own children, was diverted by his popularity, but he was also gratified by it. At this moment it was a great element of power. He was proud that, with a vicious character, after having treated these people with unprecedented neglect and contumely, he should have won back their golden opinions in a moment by the magic of manner and the splendour of wealth. His experience proved the soundness of his philosophy. Lord Monmouth worshipped gold, though if necessary he could squander it like a caliph. He had even a respect for very rich men. It was his only weakness, the only exception to his general scorn for his species. Wit, power, particular friendships, general popularity, public opinion, beauty, genius, virtue, all these are to be purchased, but it does not follow that you can buy a rich man. You may not be able or willing to spare enough. A person or thing that you perhaps could not buy became invested, in the eyes of Lord Monmouth, with a kind of halo amounting almost to sanctity. As the prey rose to the bait, Lord Monmouth resolved that they should be gorged. His banquets were doubled, a ball was announced, a public day fixed. Not only the county, but the principal inhabitants of the neighbouring borough were encouraged to attend. Lord Monmouth wished it, if possible, to be without distinction of party. He had come to reside among his old friends, to live and die where he was born. The chairman of the Conservative Association and the vice president exchanged glances which would have become Tadpole and Taper. The four attorneys nibbed their pens with increased energy, and vowed that nothing could withstand the influence of the aristocracy in the long run. All went and dined at the Castle. All returned home overpowered by the condescension of the host, the beauty of the ladies, several real princesses, the splendour of his liveries, the variety of his viands, and the flavour of his wines. It was agreed that at future meetings of the Conservative Association they should always give Lord Monmouth and the House of Lords, superseding the Duke of Wellington, who was to figure in an after toast with the Battle of Waterloo. It was not without emotion that Coningsby beheld for the first time the castle that bore his name. It was visible for several miles before he even entered the park, so proud and prominent was its position on the richly wooded steep of a considerable eminence. It was a castellated building, immense and magnificent, in a faulty and incongruous style of architecture indeed, but compensating in some degree for these deficiencies of external taste and beauty by the splendour and accommodation of its exterior, and which a Gothic castle, raised according to the strict rules of art, could scarcely have afforded. The declining sun threw over the pile a rich colour as Coningsby approached it, and lit up with fleeting and fanciful tints the delicate foliage of the rare shrubs and tall thin trees that clothed the acclivity on which it stood. Our young friend felt a little embarrassed when, without a servant and in a hack chaise, he drew up to the grand portal, and a crowd of retainers came forth to receive him. A superior servant inquired his name with a stately composure that disdained to be supercilious. It was not without some degree of pride and satisfaction that the guest replied, 'Mr. Coningsby.' The instantaneous effect was magical. It seemed to Coningsby that he was borne on the shoulders of the people to his apartment; each tried to carry some part of his luggage, and he only hoped his welcome from their superiors might be as hearty. Chapter 6. It appeared to Coningsby, in his way to his room, that the Castle was in a state of great excitement; everywhere bustle, preparation, moving to and fro, ascending and descending of stairs, servants in every corner, orders boundlessly given, rapidly obeyed, many desires, equal gratification. All this made him rather nervous. It was quite unlike Beaumanoir. That also was a palace, but it was a home. This, though it should be one to him, seemed to have nothing of that character. Of all mysteries, the social mysteries are the most appalling. Going to an assembly for the first time is more alarming than the first battle. Coningsby had never before been in a great house full of company. It seemed an overwhelming affair. The sight of the servants bewildered him. How then was he to encounter their masters? That, however, he must do in a moment. A groom of the chambers indicates the way to him, as he proceeds with a hesitating yet hurried step through several large antechambers and drawing rooms. Then doors are suddenly thrown open, and he is ushered into the largest and most sumptuous saloon that he had ever entered. It was full of ladies and gentlemen. Coningsby for the first time in his life was at a great party. His immediate emotion was to sink into the earth; but perceiving that no one even noticed him, and that not an eye had been attracted to his entrance, he regained his breath, and in some degree his composure, and standing aside endeavoured to make himself, as well as he could, master of the land. Not a human being that he had ever seen before. The circumstance of not being noticed, which a few minutes since he had felt as a relief, now became a cause of annoyance. It seemed that he was the only person standing alone whom no one was addressing. He felt renewed and aggravated embarrassment, and fancied, perhaps was conscious, that he was blushing. At length his ear caught the voice of Mr. Rigby. The speaker was not visible; he was at a distance, surrounded by a wondering group, whom he was severally and collectively contradicting; but Coningsby could not mistake those harsh, arrogant tones. He was not sorry indeed that Mr. Rigby did not observe him. Coningsby never loved him particularly, which was rather ungrateful, for he was a person who had been kind, and on the whole serviceable to him. But Coningsby writhed, especially as he grew older, under Mr. Rigby's patronising air and paternal tone. Even in old days, though attentive, Coningsby had never found him affectionate. Mr. Rigby would tell him what to do and see, but never asked him what he wished to do and see. It seemed to Coningsby that it was always contrived that he should appear the protégé or poor relation of a dependant of the family. These feelings, which the thought of Mr. Rigby had revived, caused our young friend, by an inevitable association of ideas, to remember that, unknown and unnoticed as he might be, he was the only Coningsby in that proud castle, except the lord of the castle himself; and he began to be rather ashamed of permitting a sense of his inexperience in the mere forms and fashions of society so to oppress him, and deprive him, as it were, of the spirit and carriage which became alike his character and his position. Emboldened and greatly restored to himself, Coningsby advanced into the body of the saloon. On his legs, wearing his blue ribbon, and bending his head frequently to a lady who was seated on a sofa and continually addressed him, Coningsby recognised his grandfather. Lord Monmouth was somewhat balder than 4 years ago, when he had come down to Montem, and a little more portly perhaps, but otherwise unchanged. Lord Monmouth never condescended to the artifices of the toilet, and indeed, notwithstanding his life of excess, had little need of them. Nature had done much for him, and the slow progress of decay was carried off by his consummate bearing. He looked, indeed, the chieftain of a house of whom a cadet might be proud. For Coningsby, not only the chief of his house, but his host too. In either capacity he ought to address Lord Monmouth. To sit down to dinner without having previously paid his respects to his grandfather, to whom he was so much indebted, and whom he had not seen for so many years, struck him as not only uncourtly, but as unkind and ungrateful, and indeed in the highest degree absurd. But how was he to do it? Lord Monmouth seemed deeply engaged, and apparently with some very great lady. And if Coningsby advanced and bowed, in all probability he would only get a bow in return. He remembered the bow of his first interview. It had made a lasting impression on his mind. For it was more than likely Lord Monmouth would not recognise him. 4 years had not sensibly altered Lord Monmouth, but 4 years had changed Harry Coningsby from a schoolboy into a man. Then how was he to make himself known to his grandfather? To announce himself as Coningsby, as his lordship's grandson, seemed somewhat ridiculous. To address his grandfather as Lord Monmouth would serve no purpose. To style Lord Monmouth grandfather would make every one laugh, and seem stiff and unnatural. What was he to do? To fall into an attitude and exclaim, "Behold your grandchild!" or "Have you forgotten your Harry?" Even to catch Lord Monmouth's glance was not an easy affair. He was much occupied on one side by the great lady, on the other were several gentlemen who occasionally joined in the conversation, but something must be done. There ran through Coningsby's character, as we have before mentioned, a vein of simplicity which was not its least charm. It resulted, no doubt, in a great degree from the earnestness of his nature. There never was a boy so totally devoid of affectation, which was remarkable, for he had a brilliant imagination, a quality that from its fantasies and the vague and indefinite desires it engenders, generally makes those whose characters are not formed affected. The Duchess, who was a fine judge of character, and who greatly regarded Coningsby, often mentioned this trait as one which, combined with his great abilities and acquirements so unusual at his age, rendered him very interesting. In the present instance it happened that while Coningsby was watching his grandfather, he observed a gentleman advance, make his bow, say and receive a few words, and retire. This little incident, however, made a momentary diversion in the immediate circle of Lord Monmouth, and before they could all resume their former talk and fall into their previous positions, an impulse sent forth Coningsby, who walked up to Lord Monmouth, and standing before him said, "How do you do, grandpapa?" Lord Monmouth beheld his grandson. His comprehensive and penetrating glance took in every point with a flash. There stood before him one of the handsomest youths he had ever seen, with a mien as graceful as his countenance was captivating, and his whole air breathing that freshness and ingenuousness which none so much appreciates as the used man of the world. And this was his child, the only one of his blood to whom he had been kind. It would be exaggeration to say that Lord Monmouth's heart was touched, but his good nature effervesced, and his fine taste was deeply gratified. He perceived in an instant such a relation might be a valuable adherent, an irresistible candidate for future elections, a brilliant tool to work out the dukedom. All these impressions and ideas, and many more, passed through the quick brain of Lord Monmouth ere the sound of Coningsby's words had seemed to cease, and long before the surrounding guests had recovered from the surprise which they had occasioned them, and which did not diminish when Lord Monmouth, advancing, placed his arms round Coningsby with a dignity of affection that would have become Louis XIV, and then, in the high manner of the old court, kissed him on each cheek. "Welcome to your home," said Lord Monmouth. "You have grown a great deal." Then Lord Monmouth led the agitated Coningsby to the great lady, who was a princess and an ambassadress, and then placing his arm gracefully in that of his grandson, he led him across the room and presented him in due form to some royal blood that was his guest, in the shape of a Russian Grand Duke. His Imperial Highness received our hero as graciously as the grandson of Lord Monmouth might expect, but no greeting can be imagined warmer than the one he received from the lady with whom the Grand Duke was conversing. She was a dame whose beauty was mature but still radiant. Her figure was superb, her dark hair crowned with a tiara of curious workmanship. Her rounded arm was covered with costly bracelets, but not a jewel on her finely formed bust, and the least possible rouge on her still oval cheek. Madame Colonna retained her charms. The party, though so considerable, principally consisted of the guests at the Castle. The suite of the Grand Duke included several counts and generals. Then there were the Russian ambassador and his lady, and a Russian prince and princess, their relations. The Prince and Princess Colonna and the Princess Lucretia were also paying a visit to the Marquess, and the frequency of these visits made some straight-laced magnificoes mysteriously declare that it was impossible to go to Coningsby; but as they were not asked, it did not much signify. The Marquess knew a great many very agreeable people of the highest ton, who took a more liberal view of human conduct, and always made it a rule to presume the best motives instead of imputing the worst. There was Lady St. Julians, for example, whose position was of the highest; no one more sought. She made it a rule to go everywhere and visit everybody, provided they had power, wealth, and fashion. She knew no crime except a woman not living with her husband; that was past pardon. So long as his presence sanctioned her conduct, however shameless, it did not signify; but if the husband were a brute, neglected his wife first, and then deserted her, then, if a breath but sullies her name, she must be crushed; unless indeed her own family were very powerful, which makes a difference, and sometimes softens immorality into indiscretion. Lord and Lady Gaverstock were also there, who never said an unkind thing of anybody. Her ladyship was pure as snow, but her mother having been divorced, she ever fancied she was paying a kind of homage to her parent, by visiting those who might some day be in the same predicament. There were other lords and ladies of high degree, and some who, though neither lords nor ladies, were charming people, which Lord Monmouth chiefly cared about; troops of fine gentlemen who came and went, and some who were neither fine nor gentlemen, but who were very amusing or very obliging, as circumstances required, and made life easy and pleasant to others and themselves. A new scene this for Coningsby, who watched with interest all that passed before him. The dinner was announced as served. An affectionate arm guides him at a moment of some perplexity. 'When did you arrive, Harry? We shall sit together. How is the Duchess?' inquired Mr. Rigby, who spoke as if he had seen Coningsby for the first time, but who indeed had, with that eye which nothing could escape, observed his reception by his grandfather, marked it well, and inwardly digested it. CHAPter 7.